The ink was still wet on the forged documents when Evelyn Shepard heard the hoofbeats of the Marshal's horse coming down the long dirt road toward her property, and she pressed her trembling hands flat against the kitchen table and told herself that she had done what she had to do, and that she would not apologize for it. The year was 1882, and the territory of Kansas had not yet been fully tamed by civilization, though men like the railroad barons and the land speculators were certainly trying their best to do so. Dust devils spun through the dry summer air over the high plains, and the sun baked the earth to a cracked and thirsty hardpan that made farming a kind of daily act of stubborn faith. Evelyn Shepard was 31 years old, a widow of 2 years, and she had more faith in herself than in most of the institutions that claimed authority over the lives of women like her. Her husband, Thomas Shepard, had died of a fever brought on by an infected wound he sustained when a fence post fell wrong, and he had left her with 320 acres of good wheat-growing land, a modest farmhouse that leaked in 2 places, a milk cow named Duchess, 4 chickens, and a debt to the local bank that she had been methodically paying down, season by season, with the kind of quiet determination that had become the signature of her character. She was not a woman who sought trouble. But trouble, she had learned, did not always wait to be invited. Her neighbor to the north, an older man by the name of Harold Greer, had worked his land for going on 35 years. He was 62, a widower himself, with a grown son somewhere out in Colorado who had written twice in 3 years and never offered to come home and help. Harold's farm ran alongside the eastern edge of Evelyn's own property, separated by a line of old cottonwood trees that dropped their cottony seeds every June like a soft, slow snow. Harold was the kind of man who brought over a covered dish when someone was sick, who helped mend fences without being asked, who remembered birthdays and never once made Evelyn feel like a woman alone on the prairie was something to be pitied or preyed upon. He was simply a good man, and Evelyn had counted him as something close to family in the years since Thomas had gone. So when Harlan Briggs and his operation came to town, Evelyn paid attention. Harlan Briggs was a land agent representing a consortium of investors out of St. Louis who had identified the stretch of high plains running north of Clary Creek as prime territory for a cattle operation. He was not a large man physically, but he dressed like money and spoke like a lawyer, and he had a way of smiling that never quite reached his eyes. He had arrived in the town of Caldwell, Kansas in early April of that year, set himself up at the Granger Hotel, and begun buying up parcels of land from farmers who were stretched too thin to refuse his cash offers. Some men sold willingly. Some sold because they had no real choice. And a few, like Harold Greer, refused flatly and without apology, and told Briggs to his face that no amount of money was worth 35 years of sweat and memory. Briggs had smiled at that too. What happened next was the sort of thing that left a sour taste in Evelyn's mouth every time she thought about it. Harold's land deed, which he had held for over 3 decades, suddenly became the subject of a dispute. A document appeared, produced by Briggs's legal representative, a man named Fletcher who wore his suits too tight and smelled of bay rum and ambition, which claimed that the original deed to Harold's North 40 acres had been improperly recorded back in 1849, and that the land technically reverted to territorial disposition, which meant it was eligible for Briggs's consortium to purchase directly from the land office. The document was almost certainly fraudulent. Harold knew it, and Evelyn knew it, and half the town of Caldwell knew it, but the county land office was a day's ride away in Wichita, and the man who ran it had recently developed what appeared to be a very cordial relationship with Harlan Briggs over the course of several private dinners at the hotel. Harold had come to Evelyn's door on a Tuesday evening in late June with his hat in his hands and his eyes red-rimmed and dry, the way eyes look when a man has already finished crying and is simply exhausted from it. He told her what had happened. He told her that his attorney in Wichita had said there was little he could do unless a counter-document could be produced that predated Briggs's claim. He told her that the original deed, the one Harold's father had filed in 1849, had been stored at the county courthouse in Wichita, and that building had suffered a partial fire in 1871, and several records from that period had been lost. Evelyn had listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap and her face very still, and when Harold was finished, she had asked him quietly if he still had any papers from that time, anything at all with dates or signatures or official marks. And Harold had gone home and come back with a leather satchel full of old letters, receipts, and partial documents that amounted to a scattered but suggestive record of his family's claim to the land. She had told him she would look into it. She had not told him what she planned to do. Evelyn's father had been a notary public back in Ohio before the family moved west when she was 14, and he had taught her the mechanics of official documentation with the same patience and precision he brought to everything. She had watched him copy and certify documents hundreds of times. She had a steady hand and a good eye, and she had spent Thomas's last winter learning calligraphy from a book she ordered through the dry goods store because the long evenings needed something to fill them. She was not proud of what she decided to do. She was clear-eyed about the fact that it was illegal, that it was forgery, that if discovered it could ruin her. But she was equally clear-eyed about the fact that a good man was about to lose everything he had, and that the document being used against him was itself a lie, which meant that justice required someone to tell a more honest lie in return, and she appeared to be the only person in a position to do it. She spent 3 nights on the work. She used old paper that she soaked in weak tea and dried carefully to give it the look of age. She studied the samples of period land office script from the documents Harold had brought her, and she replicated the official language and the filing marks with painstaking care. She recreated a deed for the North 40 acres that predated Briggs's disputed document by 4 years, signed with the name of a land office registrar who had actually served during that period, a man named J.W. Calloway, whose signature she found on 2 authentic documents in Harold's satchel and rendered carefully, though not perfectly, because a perfect copy would have looked too deliberate. She added a small smear of ink at the bottom corner, the kind of thing that happened naturally when a tired clerk set a wet pen down carelessly, and when she was finished, she held the document up to the lamplight and felt the cold, certain weight of what she had done settle over her like a coat in winter. She had delivered it to Harold the following morning, wrapped in cloth, and told him to take it to his attorney in Wichita and present it as something he had found in his father's old correspondence. She told him not to lie more than necessary. She told him that she would handle whatever came next. She had not anticipated that what came next would arrive in the form of Frederick Sutton. The Marshal of Caldwell, Kansas had been a man named Roy Pickens for the better part of a decade, a comfortable and essentially untroubled tenure that involved more mediating cattle disputes than enforcing serious law. But Roy Pickens had taken a fall from his horse in March and broken his hip, and the county had sent a replacement from the regional marshal's office in Wichita, while the paperwork for a proper appointment was sorted out. That replacement was Frederick Sutton, who rode into Caldwell on the 1st of July astride a dark bay gelding, carrying a saddlebag that held a well-worn copy of Blackstone's commentaries and a spare shirt, and who had the kind of quiet, watchful face that made you feel simultaneously reassured and unsettled, as though you could trust him entirely, and also that he saw more than you intended him to. He was 35 years old, lean through the jaw and broad through the shoulders, with dark eyes that were set deep beneath a straight brow, and a way of moving through a room that took up exactly the space he needed and no more. He had been a marshal for 7 years, having come to the work after a brief period as a surveyor for the railroad, which meant he understood land and maps and documents in a way that most lawmen did not. He wore his badge on his vest without any particular ceremony, and he listened more than he spoke, and within a week of his arrival in Caldwell, The general assessment of the town was that he was a serious man, not unfriendly, but not the kind you would want to cross over anything significant. Evelyn had seen him from a distance on a Wednesday when she rode into town for supplies, a tall figure in a dark coat crossing the main street with purpose, and she had not thought much about him beyond noting his presence. She had other concerns. Word had come back from Harold's attorney in Wichita that the new deed had been submitted to the land office as evidence in the dispute, and that Harlan Briggs's representative had immediately filed a challenge, claiming the document was suspect. There was now an official inquiry. The land office had sent a request to the county marshal's office to look into the provenance of the document. It was the marshal who was supposed to investigate. Evelyn learned this on a Thursday morning from the postmaster's wife, who had a talent for knowing everything that passed through official channels and an equal talent for sharing it with the right people. Evelyn had thanked her very calmly and driven her wagon home and sat in her kitchen for a long time with her hands folded and her mind working. The following Monday, Marshal Frederick Sutton rode out to Harold Greer's farm. Evelyn saw him from her own fields where she was working the south section, checking the irrigation channels that fed the wheat. She stood up straight and watched him ride past along the road, recognizing his posture, the particular straightness of his back, and she felt the first real slide of fear move through her. Not panic. She was not built for panic, but a cold, purposeful fear that sharpened her mind the way a whetstone sharpens a blade. She finished her work in the field and then walked to Harold's farm by the path through the cottonwood trees. She arrived to find the marshal seated at Harold's kitchen table, with a cup of coffee that Harold had clearly provided out of ingrained country hospitality, and a sheaf of documents spread before him that included the new deed. Harold was at the other end of the table looking like a man waiting for a verdict. The marshal looked up when Evelyn came through the open door, and his eyes were exactly as she had expected, steady and dark and measuring. "Mrs. Shepard," Harold said immediately, with relief flooding his voice as though her arrival was a reprieve. "This is Marshal Sutton. He is looking into the land business." "I know who he is," Evelyn said, and she walked to the table and looked at the marshal directly and said, "I hope you are being thorough." It was a slightly impudent thing to say to a marshal who was in the middle of an official inquiry, and she knew it, and she could see from the small shift in his expression that he registered it. "I try to be," Frederick Sutton said, and his voice was even and measured, without warmth or coldness, just a kind of professional-level quality. "Do you have knowledge of this dispute, Mrs. Shepard?" "I know that Harold Greer has worked this land for 35 years, she said. "I know that Harlan Briggs appeared in April and started making trouble for good people. And I know that Harold found that deed among his father's papers, which I believe settles the matter." "That is what is being determined," the marshal said, and he looked back at the document. He had a magnifying glass with him, she noticed, the small brass-handled kind that surveyors used, and he had been examining the deed with it before she arrived. She kept her face still and her hands clasped in front of her. The marshal asked Harold several careful questions about where the document had been found, what it had been stored with, whether there were any other papers from that period. Harold answered truthfully about everything except the source, saying only that it had been in an old leather satchel of his father's things that he had not opened in many years. All of that was true. The only thing Harold did not say was that Evelyn had been the one to find it in the satchel and recognize its significance, which was, of course, a version of events that required a considerable reinterpretation of reality. Frederick Sutton listened to all of it without interrupting, and then he sat quietly for a moment with his hands around his coffee cup, looking at the deed. Evelyn watched the back of his neck, the way his collar sat against it, the slight tension in his jaw as he thought. She did not breathe particularly freely. Then he looked up at her. "Mrs. Shepard," he said, "you have a good relationship with your neighbor here." "I do," she said. "And you were with him when he found this document. It was not precisely what Harold had said, and she understood immediately that the marshal was testing the consistency of the account. "I was present when he went through his father's papers," she said. "I helped him identify what might be relevant to his situation." The marshal looked at her for a long moment. His eyes did not move from her face, and she held his gaze with everything she had. "I see," he said. He looked back at the deed. He lifted the magnifying glass and examined the lower corner where she had made the deliberate smear of ink, and she watched his thumb move along the paper's edge, feeling the texture of it. She had soaked it in tea twice and then rubbed it with a piece of old linen to get the right feel, and she had been as careful about that as about everything else. The paper had come from Thomas's old ledger books, pages from the back where nothing had been written, paper from the late 1840s that she had kept because she used the blank backs for notes and lists. Frederick Sutton set the magnifying glass down. He looked at the deed for another long moment. Then he looked at Evelyn, and something happened in that look that she could not quite name, a kind of recognition or decision, something that passed between his observation and his judgment like a key turning in a lock. His face did not change in any dramatic way, but she saw it, the moment when he understood or suspected, or perhaps simply chose the direction he was going to walk in. He gathered the documents together and set them in a neat stack on the table. "Mr. Greer," he said, "I'll need to make a report to the county land office. I am going to recommend that the deed be considered valid unless Briggs's representative can produce compelling evidence of fraud, which I have not yet seen. The document appears consistent with other records from that period." Harold's exhale was audible. "The inquiry will take a few more weeks," the marshal continued, "but my assessment at this time is that there is insufficient cause to invalidate Mr. Greer's claim based on the challenge that has been filed." He stood and picked up his hat, and he looked at Evelyn as he did so, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched just a beat too long to be casual. "Thank you, Marshal," she said finally. "Mrs. Shepard," he said, with a slight inclination of his head, and then he said goodbye to Harold and walked out of the kitchen and down the porch steps and mounted his horse with the ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and he rode back toward Caldwell. Evelyn stood on Harold's porch and watched him go, and she was quite certain that Frederick Sutton had looked at that document and known, or at least strongly suspected, that something about it was not right, and had chosen not to pursue it. She did not know what to do with that knowledge. It sat inside her like a warm stone, uncomfortable and strangely comforting at once. She helped Harold make supper that evening, because he was too relieved and shaky to trust himself at the stove, and they ate beans and corn bread and talked about everything except what had just happened. And when she walked home through the cottonwood trees in the last of the evening light, she thought about the marshal's eyes as he looked at her, steady and dark, and seeing more than she had wanted him to see. She wondered what kind of man did what he had apparently just done. She found out gradually, the way you find things out in small towns where everyone eventually knows your business but reveals it only in pieces. She learned that Frederick Sutton was a widower himself, that his wife had died 4 years ago in Wichita of a difficult birth that had taken the child as well, and that he had come back to work almost immediately because staying still had seemed worse to him than moving. She learned this from the barber, who had learned it from the hotel keeper, who had been told by the deputy from Wichita who brought the monthly mail packet. She held this information carefully, without sentimentality, the way you hold something fragile that you are not sure belongs to you yet. She saw the marshal again the following Saturday when she rode into Caldwell for her weekly supplies. He was coming out of the telegraph office as she was going into the dry goods store, and their paths crossed on the boardwalk with the close, unavoidable proximity of a narrow walkway, and she stopped to let him pass and he stopped because she had stopped, and they stood perhaps 3 feet apart in the warm July morning with the sounds of the town around them, a horse being shod somewhere nearby, children calling from the direction of the schoolhouse, the general hum and clatter of a Saturday. "Good morning, Marshal," she said. "Mrs. Shepard," he replied. And then, after a pause that was just slightly too considered to be purely accidental, he said, "How is your wheat looking this year?" It was such an ordinary question, such a plain and practical inquiry about the actual substance of her daily life, that it caught her off guard in a way that the official interview at Harold's table had not. She felt something ease in her chest. "Better than last year," she said. "The rain in May helped." "It did," he agreed. "I've been told the whole county is expecting a good harvest. That will be welcome." "It will," she said, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and she decided to be at least partially honest because it seemed like the right thing to offer a man who had apparently already decided to extend her a significant amount of grace. "Marshal, I want to thank you for the work you did with Mr. Greer's situation." "I did the work I was sent to do," he said simply. "And that work concluded that Harold's deed was valid," she said. "It concluded that the challenge against it was insufficient," he said carefully, and there was something in the precision of the phrasing that confirmed her suspicion without either of them having to speak about it directly. "Well," she said, "Harold Greer is a good man who has worked his land honestly for 35 years, and that counts for something." "It does," he said, and his voice was quiet and direct, with none of the hedging she might have expected. "I believe it does." She nodded and thanked him again and went into the dry goods store, and she stood inside among the bolts of cloth and the barrels of flour and the smell of tobacco and coffee and soap, and let out a long, slow breath. Over the following weeks the inquiry proceeded on its official course. Harlan Briggs's representative, the polished Fletcher, filed 2 more challenges, but the marshal's report had been filed with the county office and carried weight, and with no compelling counter-evidence the challenges were denied. By the middle of August, it was clear that Harold Greer was going to keep his North 40 acres. Briggs remained in Caldwell for another 3 weeks, fuming in his hotel suite and making pointed remarks to anyone who would listen about the integrity of the investigation. But he had no particular leverage over a marshal appointed by the county rather than by local interests. And eventually, he packed his considerable luggage and departed for his next acquisition, leaving behind only the bad taste of his presence and a lesson about the limits of purchased influence. Harold came to Evelyn's door with a jar of honey from his bees, and could not speak for nearly a full minute after she opened it. She took the honey and put her hand on his arm and told him not to say anything, and he nodded and then went home, and the next day she saw smoke from his chimney and knew he was baking, which was what Harold did when he needed to express something for which he had no words. What she had not expected was what the whole business had done to her thinking about the marshal. It happened slowly, the way seasons change on the high plains, gradually and then suddenly, so that one day you look up and realize that summer has become autumn while you were occupied with the daily business of living. She thought about Frederick Sutton with an increasing frequency that she found both inconvenient and difficult to ignore. She thought about the way he had looked at that deed and then looked at her. She thought about his question regarding the wheat. She thought about the precision of his language, the way he chose his words as though each one had a cost, and he was willing to pay it but not more than the exact right amount. She thought about the fact that he was a widower, and she was a widow, and they were both people who had learned to live without the person they had expected to spend their lives beside, and she understood exactly what the shape of that kind of loneliness felt like from the inside, and she suspected he did too. She was not a woman given to romantic fantasy. She was too practical and too busy and too thoroughly acquainted with the real weight of daily life on the prairie for that. But she began to notice, with the sharp clarity of someone who is paying attention even when she wishes she were not, that when she was in Caldwell on Saturdays, she watched for the marshal's dark coat moving along the main street, that she was aware of his horse tied in front of the office, that the quality of the morning seemed slightly different depending on whether she saw him or not. In early September she met him properly for the 3rd time, not as widow and marshal or as suspected forger and investigating official, but simply as two people who arrived at the same fence post along the road between their respective properties at the same moment, because the road curved there, and neither of them saw the other until they were almost beside each other. She was on foot, walking back from Harold's where she had gone to help with the preserving, carrying a basket with 3 jars of plum preserves that Harold had insisted she take. He was on his horse, riding the road that ran along the property edges on an afternoon round of the outlying farms, which she had heard he did regularly as a way of keeping the peace through visible presence. His horse startled slightly at her sudden appearance around the bend, and he settled it with a quiet word and a hand on its neck, and then he looked down at her from the saddle and said, with what she was beginning to recognize as his particular brand of dry understatement, "You appear to have survived the preserving." She looked at her hands, which were stained purple from the plums, and she laughed, which surprised her because she had not laughed much in 2 years and she had forgotten the ease of it when it came honestly. "Barely," she said. He swung down from the saddle because it was clearly easier to talk without her craning her neck, and he walked beside her along the road, leading his horse, and they talked. She could not have told you afterward exactly what they talked about, because it was the way of such conversations that it is the feeling rather than the content that you carry away with you. And the feeling of that walk along the dusty road in the September afternoon, with the cottonwood leaves beginning to yellow at their edges, was one of extraordinary ease, as though she had known this man in some other life and was simply remembering him now. He asked about her farm with the particular curiosity of someone who had been a surveyor, and genuinely found the practical mechanics of land interesting. She asked about his work in Wichita before Caldwell, and he told her about some of it, not the dramatic parts, which she suspected he minimized because lawmen who had been at it long enough learned that dramatic stories mostly had sad endings, but the everyday parts, the work of keeping people from harming one another in the ordinary ways that temper and desperation and bad luck caused harm. He spoke about it honestly and without pretension, and she appreciated that very much. They reached the turning for her farm road and stopped, and he held his horse's reins and stood in the golden afternoon light with the grassland around them and the wide prairie sky overhead and looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. "Mrs. Shepard," he said, "would you be offended if I called on you one evening, not in an official capacity?" The directness of it pleased her. She had not expected anything less. "I would not be offended," she said. "Thursday evening, if that suits you," he said. "Thursday evening," she agreed, and picked up her basket of preserves and walked up her farm road, and did not allow herself to look back to see if he was watching her go, though she very strongly suspected he was. He came on Thursday as he had said he would, arriving at 6 o'clock with the kind of punctuality that she was coming to understand was simply the expression of his character applied to small things as readily as large ones. He had brought a tin of good coffee beans from the dry goods store, a practical gift that she appreciated far more than she might have appreciated flowers, because coffee was expensive and useful, and showed that he was thinking about her actual daily life rather than a romantic notion of it. She made the coffee and they sat at her kitchen table and talked for 3 hours while the evening dark gathered outside the window and the lamp made its warm circle between them. He asked her about Thomas, directly and without the hedged delicacy that most people applied to the subject, and she told him about her husband honestly, the good parts and the difficult parts, the way Thomas had been a steady and kind man but not a man of particular imagination, and how she had loved him and grieved him and also, quietly and without guilt, grown into herself after his absence in ways she could not have predicted. Frederick listened to this without trying to redeem or contextualize it, which was the right thing to do. She asked about his wife, whose name had been Clara, and he told her with a measured quietness that suggested the grief was not gone, but had been lived with long enough to be carried without constant injury. Clara had been a schoolteacher. She had been funny and determined, and she had read more books than anyone Frederick had ever known. She had died at 28 and Frederick had been 29, and it was the kind of thing that changed the shape of a person's life permanently, not in a way that prevented further living, but in a way that meant you lived differently afterward, with a certain knowledge of what could be lost. "You understand that," he said to Evelyn, not as a question. "I do," she said. The lamp burned lower and neither of them moved to trim it, because that would have meant acknowledging the lateness of the hour and the fact that he should probably go, and neither of them was quite ready for that. Eventually she did trim it and he did stand and take his hat from the hook by the door, and she walked him to the porch. The night was very clear, the way Kansas nights are in September, with a depth of sky and stars that feels like something you could fall into if you lean too far back. They stood on the porch for another few minutes in the comfortable silence of people who have found that silence together is not uncomfortable. And then he said good night and walked to his horse, and she watched him ride down her farm road in the starlight and stood on the porch for a long time after he was gone. He came again the following Thursday, and then the one after that, and the visiting became a kind of quiet rhythm that fit itself into the larger rhythm of her weeks without any particular drama or announcement. The town of Caldwell noticed, because small towns always notice such things, but the notice was largely benign because Evelyn Shepard was a respected woman and Frederick Sutton was a well-regarded marshal, and there was nothing in their situation that invited gossip of the unkind kind. Harold Greer noticed too, and said nothing directly about it, but began showing up on Tuesday mornings to help with whatever heavy work needed doing on her farm, which was a form of approval she understood perfectly. In October, on a Thursday evening, something shifted. It had been a difficult week for Evelyn. The north fence had come down in a windstorm, and she had spent 2 days repairing it, and one of her chickens had been taken by something in the night, and a letter had arrived from the bank in Caldwell reminding her that the fall payment on her mortgage was due. She had known all of this was coming, and she had the money set aside, but the combination of the physical exhaustion and the general weight of being solely responsible for a farm and a life had settled over her in the way it did sometimes, not catastrophically but heavily, and she was not quite her best self when Frederick arrived on Thursday evening. She told him so, standing in the kitchen with flour on her apron because she had been baking and had not heard him arrive until his knock, and she said, "I am afraid I am poor company tonight. It has been a wearing week." He looked at her with those steady eyes and did not offer sympathy in the performative way that some men did. He said simply, "Tell me about it." So she did. She sat down at the table and he sat across from her, and she told him about the fence and the chicken and the bank letter. And she told him about the larger weight of it, the constant arithmetic of a farm woman alone, the way there was never a moment when the accounting of everything was not running somewhere in the back of her mind. She had not spoken about this to anyone, because there was something that felt almost like complaint in saying it out loud, and she was not by nature a woman who complained. He listened to all of it and then he said, "You are carrying a great deal." "Most people carry a great deal," she said. "That is true," he said. "It does not make what you carry lighter." She looked at him. The lamp was between them on the table and the light was warm and she was tired and she had flour on her apron and she was 31 years old and she had been alone for 2 years, and something in the straightforward kindness of him undid something she had been holding tightly. "Frederick," she said, and she did not even notice that she had used his first name until she heard it in the air between them. "Why did you not report what you found?" She did not say what she meant explicitly. She did not need to. They had been speaking around this for 3 months with the care of people handling something that could break in either direction, and now she had said the thing directly. He was quiet for a moment, his hands around his coffee cup. "What do you think I found?" he said. "I think you found a document that was too well made for what it claimed to be," she said. "The paper was right, but the ink was wrong by a shade. The filing mark was accurate but placed too precisely, because someone who actually stamped documents hundreds of times would have been slightly careless, and someone doing it deliberately for the first time would have been careful. I know what I did. I have thought about it every day since. The kitchen was very quiet. You made a mistake with the ink, he said finally, a very small one. The specific compound used in land office records in 1849 was different from what is commercially available now, different mineral content. You have experience with documents from your surveying work, she said. I do, he said. And you knew, she said. He looked at her steadily. I suspected, he said carefully. I could not have proven it conclusively without laboratory analysis, and that would have required sending the document to Wichita, which would have created consequences that seemed to me to be disproportionate to what I understood about the situation. What you understood about the situation, she repeated. Harlan Briggs is the sort of man who manufactures legitimacy for theft, he said, with a directness and a quiet anger that she had not heard from him before. I have seen his type in 3 counties. He uses courts and documents and legal language as weapons to take things from people who worked honestly for them. I am not saying what you did was legal. I am saying that when I looked at the whole of the situation, the 35 years of evidence of Harold Greer's occupancy, the convenient appearance of Briggs's challenge, the character of the man making the challenge, and the character of the woman who I believe acted in response to it, I made a judgment. That judgment could have cost you your badge, she said. It could have, he agreed. Why? She asked, because she needed to hear him say it, not to expose him, but because it mattered to her that she understood what kind of man had done what he had done. He looked at her for a long moment, and something happened in his expression, not quite a softening but a kind of opening, as though he were allowing her a view of something he did not ordinarily show. Because I have been a marshal long enough to understand that the law and justice are not always the same thing, he said. And because Harold Greer was clearly a good man who was being robbed by someone with better lawyers. And because when I looked at you sitting across that table in his kitchen, I knew exactly what you were, and I thought that a woman like you should not go to prison for doing the right thing in the only way available to her. Evelyn looked at him. She was not a woman who cried easily, but there was a pressure behind her eyes that she recognized and chose not to give in to. That is a great deal to know about someone you had just met, she said. I am good at reading people, he said simply. It is most of what the work requires. And what am I? She asked. What did you decide I was? He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him choose his words the way she had come to appreciate, with care and without embellishment. Someone with more courage than sense, he said, and more loyalty than the law allows for. Someone who loves the people in her life fiercely and quietly and without needing credit for it. The kitchen was very warm and very small in that moment, with the lamp between them and the October night pressing cold against the windows. Frederick, she said, and this time she was fully aware of using his name, I think you are a remarkable man. I think you are a remarkable woman, he said. I have thought so since you walked into that kitchen and looked at me like I was something to be determined rather than deferred to. She laughed at that, and he smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile fully, without the professional reserve, just openly. And it was a good smile, the kind that suggested a whole person behind it who was capable of joy. He reached across the table, not impulsively but with the deliberate care he brought to everything, and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand under his and held it. They sat like that for a while, with the lamp burning and the prairie dark and enormous outside the window, and Evelyn felt something she had not felt in 2 years, the particular warmth of not being alone with everything. November came in cold and fast, as it did on the high plains, and with it came the work of winter preparation, the laying in of stores, the banking of the farmhouse against drafts, the particular accounting that a farm woman does in autumn to ensure that everything she has grown and harvested is sufficient to carry her through to spring. Evelyn worked her days and looked forward to her Thursday evenings with a pleasure that she did not try to minimize or apologize for. Life was too short for that, she had learned. Frederick came every Thursday, and some Sundays he rode out in the early afternoon, and they fell into the comfortable habit of two people who were learning each other without rush, because both of them had already learned once what it was to know someone and lose them, and there was a natural carefulness in that, not a fearfulness but a deliberateness, a sense that this was something worth taking time with. He helped her with the banking of the farmhouse one Sunday in late November, the heavy work of packing straw against the foundation walls that she usually did alone, and working beside him in the cold afternoon air with her breath making clouds and his shoulder close to hers as they moved along the side of the house. She felt the full, simple pleasure of having someone share the work of her life. Harold Greer watched them from his side of the cottonwood trees with what she could only describe as quiet satisfaction. December brought the first real snow, and with it a crisis that she had not anticipated. A letter arrived from the county marshal's office in Wichita informing Frederick that his temporary appointment was being concluded, as a permanent marshal had been appointed for Caldwell, a man named Arthur Welch who would arrive in January. Frederick had been offered a return to his position in Wichita or a new assignment in the expanding territory to the west, and he had a week to give his answer. He told her on a Thursday evening in December, sitting at her table with the snow falling outside the window in the soft, steady way that settled over everything and made the world very quiet. She listened to this and kept her face still in the way she had trained herself to do when information required processing before response. "What will you do?" she asked. "I have not decided," he said, and he looked at her steadily. She looked back at him. The fire in the stove was warm and the snow was falling, and she had known this man for 5 months, and she was quite certain she was in love with him, not in the breathless, urgent way of novels, but in the deep, practical, whole way of a woman who knows her own mind and has spent time learning another person's. "I have a farm here," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "And I have no intention of leaving it," she said. "Thomas and I built this farm. I have kept it for 2 years on my own. I intend to keep it." "That is absolutely as it should be," he said, without any reservation. "So," she said, "if a person were to think about remaining in Caldwell, it would need to be a decision based on the place itself, and not on external factors that might not continue to exist." He understood her perfectly. She could see it. "Evelyn," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice was its own kind of declaration. "I am not good at many things, but I am very good at knowing my own mind. I have known my own mind about this for some time. I was simply waiting for the right occasion to say so." "Is this the right occasion?" she asked. "I believe it is," he said. "I would like to stay in Caldwell. I would like to find work that keeps me here, whether that is the marshal's position or something else. And I would like to continue coming to your kitchen on Thursday evenings for the foreseeable future, and I would like that to mean something formal if you are willing." It was, she thought, possibly the least romantic proposal she had ever heard, and also precisely the kind she had wanted, direct and practical and completely without pretense. "I am willing," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she held it, and outside the window the snow fell on the high plains of Kansas in the deep December of 1882, and the farmhouse was warm, and Harold Greer's lights were visible through the cottonwood trees, and the world was not simple or easy or free of injustice. But in that kitchen with that man, Evelyn Shepard felt the future open up before her with a generosity that she had not quite allowed herself to anticipate. They were married in February of 1883, on the 14th day of the month, which was Harold Greer's suggestion, delivered with a shyness that Evelyn found extremely endearing from a man of 62. The ceremony was performed by the traveling minister who came through Caldwell on his monthly circuit, in the parlor of the Caldwell church, with Harold standing up with Frederick and the postmaster's wife standing up with Evelyn, and perhaps 40 people from the town and surrounding farms filling the pews. Evelyn wore a dress that she had made herself from deep blue wool that she had ordered in from Wichita specifically for the occasion, and she wore Thomas's mother's brooch at her collar, because Thomas had been a good man, and she honored his memory even as she stepped fully into her new life. Frederick wore his good dark coat and a new white shirt and looked at her as she came up the aisle beside Harold, who was giving her away with a solemnity that made him appear approximately 62 going on 100. And Frederick's expression when he saw her was the quiet, whole expression of a man who was not performing happiness but simply feeling it. The minister read the words and they said the words back, and Frederick put a plain gold band on her finger that had been his mother's, which he had carried in his coat pocket for 6 weeks, and she held his hands and looked at him and meant every single word she said. In the direct and complete way she did everything. There was a gathering afterward at the church hall, with food that half the town had contributed, and dancing to a fiddle played by a young cowboy named Cole Hendricks, who had the gift of making everyone's feet move regardless of their intentions. And Harold Greer drank 2 cups of the cider that someone had spiked with apple brandy, and told a story about Thomas Shepard and a runaway mule that made everyone laugh. And Frederick danced with Evelyn in the warm, crowded hall with his hand on her waist and his eyes on her face, and she thought that happiness, the real kind, felt remarkably like being exactly where you were supposed to be. They moved Frederick's few belongings out of the boarding house where he had been staying and into Evelyn's farmhouse, which was, as she told him, his farmhouse now as well, and they began the business of building a life together with the same practical seriousness they brought to everything. Frederick had written to the county office in December and informed them that he was resigning the Marshal's appointment because he had accepted a position as deputy to the newly appointed Arthur Welch, which kept him in Caldwell at a significantly reduced travel requirement and allowed him to be home most evenings. He was also, it turned out, a useful person to have on a farm, not because he had farming experience, because he did not, but because he was methodical and strong and completely willing to be taught, and Evelyn found teaching him the rhythms and requirements of the land deeply satisfying, because he paid the kind of attention to instruction that made teaching a pleasure rather than a labor. He learned to read the weather with the patience of a man who understood that the land had its own logic. He learned which of the irrigation channels needed clearing first after a rain. He learned that Duchess the milk cow had strong opinions about who milked her and required a period of quiet conversation before she would cooperate. He learned all of this without complaint or self-consciousness, because he was not a man troubled by not knowing things, only by not learning them when the opportunity was present. They talked in the evenings as they had always talked, about everything. They read to each other from the books that accumulated on the shelf beside the kitchen table, because Frederick had ordered several from an Eastern catalog, and Evelyn had her own collection including 3 novels that she read and reread, because there was comfort in known stories. She discovered that he had a dry and precise sense of humor that came out only when he was relaxed, and that he laughed genuinely and without self-consciousness, and that in the mornings before he had fully woken, he was wonderfully human, and without his professional composure, which she found extremely endearing. Spring came early in 1883, with warm rains in March that pushed the wheat up strong and green across Evelyn's fields, and with the spring came a piece of news that she told Frederick on a Tuesday evening in April when Harold was over for supper. And Harold almost knocked over his water glass, and then recovered and shook Frederick's hand very formally, and then turned to Evelyn and said simply, "Good," in a voice that contained everything he had ever wanted to say about her well-being and her future, and his deep and genuine affection for her, all compressed into a single syllable. Evelyn was expecting their first child. She was not frightened of it, because she was not the kind of woman who was frightened of things she could not change and could prepare for, but she was aware of the particular tenderness of this new fact, the way it changed the weight and texture of everything. She watched Frederick receive the news and saw him go through something, a brief and private thing behind his eyes, that she understood was the shadow of Clara and of what had been lost. And she let him have that moment, and then she took his hand and held it until he came back to the present and looked at her. And she saw that he was both afraid and enormously, quietly glad. "We will be careful," she said to him, and she meant something larger than practical caution. She meant that she understood the particular terror of loving someone you knew you could lose, and that she intended to meet it head on rather than be undone by it, and that she would need him to do the same. "Yes," he said, "we will." She was practical about the pregnancy in the way she was practical about everything, continuing her work on the farm through the summer with adjustments for what she could and could not do. And Frederick took on the heaviest lifting without comment, and without making her feel managed or diminished, which was the right approach, and she appreciated it. Harold Greer began appearing on Tuesday mornings with even greater regularity, bringing vegetables from his garden and mending small things around the farmhouse with the focused energy of a man who has finally found a purpose sufficient to his capacity for caring. The summer of 1883 was a good one. The wheat grew well, and the harvest in August was the best Evelyn had managed since Thomas died, and with Frederick's help, the whole of it was cut and bundled and sold in less time than it had ever taken her alone. She stood at the edge of the field on the last day of harvesting with her hands on her back and the afternoon sun warm on her face, and looked at the cleared land, and felt the deep, animal satisfaction of work completed and provision secured. Frederick came to stand beside her, dust on his coat and weariness in his face, and something very much like pride in his eyes. Not pride in himself, but in the fact of the work and in her, in the whole of what she had built and continued to build. "Your land," he said, looking out over the harvested field. "Our land," she corrected. He put his arm around her shoulders carefully, with the gentleness he had developed around her as her pregnancy advanced, and she leaned into him, which was something she had gradually and completely stopped considering unusual, the simple physical comfort of leaning into someone you trusted. The child was born in October, on a morning when the cottonwood trees were fully gold and the air had the sharp clarity of early autumn. It was a boy. Frederick was present throughout, in the way that was not universally practiced but that Evelyn had made clear she expected, and he was steady and useful, and only showed how frightened he was in the grip of his hand around hers when the work was most difficult. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Tanner who had delivered half the babies in the county, declared it a fine and healthy birth, and deposited a son into Frederick's arms with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who had done so many times before. Frederick looked down at the child in his arms, this small and complete person, and something happened in his face that Evelyn watched from the bed with tears on her own cheeks that she did not try to prevent. She watched him receive this miracle with the full, unguarded openness of a man who had believed for 4 years that this particular joy was something that had been closed to him, and she loved him so completely in that moment that she felt it as a physical thing, a warmth in her chest that had nothing sentimental about it, just the full, solid fact of loving someone. They named him Thomas Frederick Sutton, and he had his mother's set of the jaw and his father's dark eyes, and Harold Greer held him that evening with the careful reverence of a man who had not expected to be trusted with something so precious, and wept without any apparent embarrassment whatsoever. The years passed, as years do on the high plains, with their seasons and their trials and their compensations. Harlan Briggs never returned to Caldwell, having found more profitable territories elsewhere, and the land dispute that had set everything in motion faded from active concern into the category of stories people told to illustrate the kind of trouble that could come and the kind of community that could resist it. The forged deed sat in Harold's satchel undisturbed, its secret held by 3 people who kept it absolutely, and the North 40 acres produced its crops every year with the steady reliability of land that has been properly cared for. Frederick settled into the life of the county with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to everything. He rose in the Marshal's structure over the following years, first to senior deputy, and then, when Arthur Welch retired in 1886, to the position of Marshal of Caldwell proper, which he had not sought but accepted because the town asked him, and because he had come to love the place and its people in the particular way that men love the places where their real lives begin. He was, Evelyn believed, the best marshal the county had ever had, not because he was the fastest draw, though he was reasonably competent, or because he was the most imposing figure, though he was certainly not small, but because he understood that law and justice required constant interpretation against the actual circumstances of actual human lives, and he was never too proud or too rigid to make that interpretation honestly. He was also a remarkable father, which had surprised her not at all, because the care he brought to everything he did was simply redirected toward the children, and it was expressed in the same way it was expressed everywhere, in patience and precision, and the willingness to sit with a difficulty rather than rush past it. Thomas grew into a sturdy and curious boy with an absolute fascination with how mechanical things worked, and a second-born, a daughter they called me, arrived in 1885 with red hair that neither parent could account for, and a disposition that was entirely her own from the first moment, emphatic and joyful and deeply stubborn. She would, Evelyn told Frederick with perfect accuracy, cause them considerable adventure. Harold Greer was as much a grandfather to both children as a neighbor could be without blood connection, and he taught Thomas to keep bees and taught me to bake bread, and he spent Sunday evenings at the Sutton table with the regularity and comfort of family, because he was family, the kind that you choose and that holds. In the spring of 1887, when Thomas was 3.5 and me was 18 months old, and the wheat was showing its first green in the March fields, Evelyn was in the kitchen making bread when Frederick came in from the morning round and sat down at the kitchen table with his hat on the board and his hands around the coffee cup she put in front of him, and he looked at her in the particular way he had, steady and direct and slightly amused at some private observation. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was simply thinking." "About what?" she said, because she had learned over 4 years that his silences were always about something specific. "About the fact that I came to this town as a temporary measure," he said, "and that I owe the whole of my actual life to a forged land document." She looked at him. She was wiping flour from her hands on her apron, standing across the kitchen from him in the warm morning light, and she felt something rise in her chest that was equal parts laughter and love, and the complicated weight of the choice she had made that night at the kitchen table with the ink still wet. "Do you have regrets about that?" she asked. He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. "Not a single one," he said simply. She crossed the kitchen and sat beside him at the table, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. And through the window, the March fields were greening, and Harold's chimney was sending up its thin column of smoke, and somewhere in the house, a small voice that was Thomas called for his mother in the pleasant, imperious way of children who have no doubt that they will be heard. "You knew," she said, not for the first time, because it was something they returned to occasionally, not with guilt or anxiety but as a kind of compass point between them. "You knew what I had done." "I suspected," he said, which was what he always said because the precision mattered to him and because neither of them had ever wanted to make it more dramatic than it was. "You could have ruined everything," she said. "Harold's farm, my life, your career." "Yes," he said, "but you said you had not seen anything." "I said there was insufficient cause to invalidate the deed," he said, with the mild correctness of a man who had been a deputy and then a marshal for a long time and was careful about the exact words of official positions. Which was entirely true. I had not seen anything conclusive. She lifted her head and looked at him. "Frederick," she said. "Evelyn," he said back, with that slight dry warmth she loved. "Thank you," she said, for perhaps the 100th time, and she meant it as she always meant it, not as a transaction or an obligation, but as the acknowledgment of a gift freely given, of a judgment made in favor of grace over procedure, by a man who understood the difference and chose the right one. He kissed her forehead, and she settled back against his shoulder, and Thomas called again from the interior of the house, and me began to sing something that was not recognizably any song that existed, but was being performed with great conviction, and the bread needed to go back to its rising, and the morning was full of the pleasant, irreplaceable, ordinary business of a life that was whole. The summer of 1887 brought another dry stretch that worried the wheat through July, but the August rains came through at last, and the harvest, while not as grand as 1883, was solid enough, and Frederick helped with the cutting as he always did, working the long rows beside her hired hand, a young man of 20 named James Whitfield who had come looking for work in May and turned out to be capable and honest and willing to learn. James had a sweetness of disposition that reminded Evelyn of Thomas in certain lights, and she was glad to have him on the farm. Harold Greer's health was beginning to show the weight of his years in the autumn of 1887, a slowing of his movements and a shortness of breath on cold days that worried Evelyn. She began making sure that someone checked on him daily, either herself or Frederick or James, and she brought meals over twice a week rather than once. And Harold submitted to this care with a gracious dignity that made it possible for everyone involved to pretend it was nothing out of the ordinary. He was 67 and he had worked his land for 40 years and he was tired, but he was not broken, and his mind was as clear as it had ever been. He told Evelyn one November evening when she had come over to sit with him and found him in his rocking chair by the fire with a satisfied look on his face, that he had written to his son in Colorado. "He is coming in the spring," Harold said. "Is he?" Evelyn said, and managed to keep the surprise from her voice. "I told him," Harold said simply, "that it was past time." She did not ask what he had told his son about what had happened with the land, because that was between Harold and his own family, and she respected that boundary. But she sat beside him by the fire and they talked about the farm and the winter coming and the children. And when she went home through the cottonwood trees in the dark, the cold was clean and sharp, and the stars were very bright. And she thought about all the ways that one decision could send its effects rippling out through time like rings on water, touching things you could not have predicted from the moment of the stone. Harold's son, Daniel Greer, arrived from Colorado in April of 1888, a quiet man of 38 with his father's steady eyes and something apologetic about his posture that softened as the weeks passed, and he saw that his father was genuinely glad to have him without condition or accusation. Daniel settled into the farm work with a willingness that spoke of someone returning to something he had always known and had needed time to come back to. He and Frederick found each other's company congenial, two men of similar temperament who understood practical work and were not given to unnecessary talking. And by summer Daniel Greer had taken over the running of his father's farm and Harold was spending his days in his rocking chair by the window, watching the fields he had fought for with the serene satisfaction of a man who has secured what matters and can now rest within that security. In the fall of 1888, Evelyn discovered she was expecting again, and she told Frederick one evening after the children were in bed, watching his face as she did so. He received this with the full, uncomplicated joy of a man who had no ambivalence about it, which was exactly what she had known he would feel, because she knew him very well by then. He took her hands across the kitchen table and said, "Good," in a voice that carried everything Harold had meant by the same word 5 years earlier, and she laughed and squeezed his hands and they sat together for a long time in the warm kitchen with the fire burning and the prairie dark around the farmhouse and the sound of their children sleeping in the next room. The third child was born in May of 1889, another boy, delivered by Mrs. Tanner with the experienced efficiency of the familiar, and he came into the world with a strong voice and very definite opinions about his situation which he expressed at considerable volume and at length. They named him Harold James Sutton, for Harold Greer and for James Whitfield, who had become so thoroughly a part of the Sutton household that naming a child for him seemed simply appropriate. And James Whitfield himself, when told of this honor, turned a remarkable shade of red and was unable to speak for several seconds, and then shook Frederick's hand with both of his and said, with the plainness of genuine feeling, that it meant everything to him. Harold Greer held his namesake on the porch on a May afternoon in 1889, with his son Daniel sitting beside him and the fields green around them and the cottonwood trees showing their new leaves. And he looked at the baby with the expression of a man who understands. He has lived exactly the right amount of time to see exactly the right things. And he said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent thing he could have said. Frederick was promoted to senior marshal of the county in 1890, a territory that extended well beyond Caldwell and required occasional travel, which he managed by building a competent staff of deputies and by being extremely organized about which days he needed to be elsewhere. He was gone 2 or 3 days a week on average, and Evelyn managed the farm during those absences with the experienced ease of someone who had done it alone for 2 years and knew exactly what she was capable of. She had James, who was now a permanent fixture, and she had Daniel Greer nearby, and she had the rhythms of the land itself, which she had learned over many years to read and respond to with something close to instinct. When Frederick came home from those trips, he came home fully, without the partial attention of a man whose mind remained in the work when his body returned to the family. He came through the door, and Thomas ran to him, and me told him at length about everything that had happened in his absence, in the emphatic and sequential way she approached all narrative. And little Harold pulled himself upright against the doorframe to demonstrate his latest developmental achievement. And Evelyn watched all of this from the kitchen doorway and felt, every time, the particular quality of happiness that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the presence of something worth all of the difficulty. They had built a good life. Not an easy one, because the high plains of Kansas were not interested in making life easy, and the work of farming and law and raising children and being married to a real person rather than a romantic ideal required constant, honest effort. But a good life, built on the foundation of who they actually were rather than who they wished they were, and that kind of foundation held. One evening in the autumn of 1890, when Thomas was 7 and could read almost anything put in front of him, and had recently developed an obsession with the mechanics of windmills, and me was 5 and conducting herself through the world as though it had been built specifically for her purposes, and Harold the younger was 1½ and ambulatory, and therefore required constant observation. Frederick and Evelyn sat on the porch after the children were in bed. In the particular quiet that descended over the farm when they were finally alone in the evening with the stars out, and the grassland smelling of dry autumn grass and the distant coyote calling in the dark, and Frederick said, Thinking about the land. What about it? She said. Whether we ought to expand, he said. James is 23 now and capable of managing a larger operation. There is a parcel to the south that has come available, 160 acres with a creek running through it, good for cattle. She considered this. That is a significant investment, she said. It is, he agreed. But our position is strong. The harvest these last 3 years has been good. The mortgage is paid down to nearly nothing. I think we can do it. She looked out at the dark fields and thought about it with the practical assessment she always brought to land questions. Show me the survey map, she said. He smiled. She knew he had expected no other answer. They bought the south parcel in the spring of 1891, and it was Frederick who drew up the proper documents himself, every word of them correct and accurate and properly filed, which Evelyn observed with a quiet amusement that she did not express but that he absolutely knew she felt, because they were past the point of needing to be indirect about anything. I am a more careful documentarian than some, he said simply, when he came home with the officially filed copies. You are indeed, she said. I am particularly attentive to the details of land records, he said, and the edge of a smile in his voice was unmistakable. "Frederick," she said. "Evelyn," he said, with the same warmth he always put into her name. She took the documents from him and looked at them, and they were precisely correct, every jot and tittle, and she thought about a winter night 8 years passed with wet ink and old tea-stained paper and the cold, certain weight of a choice, and she thought about dark eyes reading a document by lamplight and looking up at her, and seeing exactly what she was and not reporting it. "I have never regretted it," she said. "What I did, I want you to know that." He looked at her directly as he always did, without deflection. "Nor have I," he said, "what I chose not to report." She held the documents against her chest and looked at him in the morning light of the kitchen they had shared for 8 years. This man who was her husband and her partner and the father of her children and the person she trusted most completely in the world. And she felt the whole of her life as a thing of great and specific beauty, not perfect but real, not simple but true. "Come look at the south field," she said. "James has the fence line nearly finished, and I want your opinion on the creek crossing." "I will get my coat," he said. Harold Greer died peacefully in the spring of 1892, in his own bed, in his own house, on the farm that he had kept for 40 years, and that his son would keep after him. He had been declining through the winter but had remained comfortable, and Evelyn had spent many afternoons sitting with him, and in the last weeks he had talked often about his wife, and about the years of building the farm, and about how satisfied he was, not in a resigned way but genuinely, with the full conviction of a man who has reviewed his life and found it well spent. He told Evelyn 2 days before the end, in a voice that was quiet but clear, that she should not feel any guilt about what she had done for him all those years ago. "I have thought about it," he said, "and I believe that what you did was an act of love, and I have not in my life been given many gifts as fine as that one." She held his hand and did not try to speak. "And you found a good man," he said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who had hoped for this and seen it come to pass. "He sees you clearly, that one. That is everything, to be seen clearly and loved anyway. That is everything." She was there when he passed, and Frederick was there, and Daniel, and the spring was coming through the window with the smell of new earth and the sound of birds, and it was a gentle ending, the kind that the very old who have lived fully sometimes achieve, as though the world is willing to receive them gently because they gave it enough. They buried Harold in the small cemetery at the edge of town, in the spring earth, and Frederick stood beside Evelyn at the graveside and held her hand, and Daniel Greer and James Whitfield and half of Caldwell turned out to pay their respects, because Harold had been the kind of person whose absence was felt as a specific loss by a whole community. Evelyn cried at the gravesite, fully and without apology, because Harold had been her family and she had loved him and he was gone, and grief was the true price of love and she was willing to pay it. She wept at the grave and Frederick stood beside her without trying to fix it, only present, which was the right thing, and she was grateful for it. The seasons continued to turn. Thomas grew into a young man of serious purpose who went east to study engineering at 17, the first of Evelyn's children to receive a formal higher education, which Frederick had insisted on financing without any discussion of the cost being prohibitive, because it was not, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. Thomas wrote long letters home about what he was learning and shorter letters about whether he was eating enough and was well, the latter being what Evelyn actually wanted to know. Me grew into herself with the full force of her particular personality, which was considerable, and at 14 was already the most formidable student at the Caldwell School, and had opinions about women's suffrage that she expressed with an eloquence that was occasionally alarming to people who did not know her family. Frederick encouraged this without reservation, which was, Evelyn thought, one of the finest things about him. Young Harold was a sunny and sociable child who collected friends the way some children collected rocks, effortlessly and with great discrimination, and who had his grandfather Harold Greer's quality of making the people around him feel comfortable and valued without any particular effort. Daniel Greer farmed the Northland well and was a good neighbor and a good man. And in 1894, he married a woman named Ruth who was a schoolteacher, and who came over for Sunday dinner regularly, and who was, Frederick observed with satisfaction, exactly the kind of person that the community needed more of. The farmhouse expanded over the years, a second bedroom and then a proper parlor, the leaking places finally properly repaired, a good solid barn to replace the one that had always been slightly too small. The farm itself expanded south to the creek parcel and west to a smaller tract they added in 1893, and Evelyn walked the perimeter of it sometimes in the evenings, her and Frederick's land, and felt the particular pride of people who have built something real and lasting. On an October evening in 1895, Evelyn and Frederick sat on their expanded porch in the chairs they had moved out as the autumn evening was warm enough still. With the harvest done and the wheat sold, and the accounts in good order and the children at various stages of their various lives, Thomas at his engineering studies, me at the Caldwell School, young Harold at 8 years old asleep in his bed, with his collection of carved wooden horses arranged exactly as he required them. And the prairie stretched out in the last of the evening light, turning gold and then amber and then deep and soft in the gathering dark. Frederick had a cup of coffee. Evelyn had a shawl pulled around her shoulders. The stars were coming out over the high plains in their millions, the kind of sky that made the smallness of human concerns seem not oppressive but simply correctly proportioned, part of a larger and ongoing creation that continued regardless of the specific anxieties of any given day. "Do you remember," Evelyn said, "the night I finished the deed?" "I was not there," he pointed out. "No," she said, "you were not. I was alone in this kitchen, and I had just done something illegal and irreversible, and I was frightened." "What were you thinking?" he asked. She considered. "I was thinking that Harold had 35 years of his life on that land and that Harlan Briggs had stolen his way to everything he had, and that the law was supposed to protect people like Harold from people like Briggs, and since it had failed to do so, someone else was going to have to step in." She paused. "And I was thinking that I might go to prison for it." "You might have," he said. "And then you came," she said. "I came to investigate," he said mildly. "And you looked at the document," she said. "And you looked at me and you decided something." "I decided that the evidence before me did not meet the standard required for an adverse finding," he said, with the precise official language she recognized as his particular kind of humor. "Frederick," she said. "Evelyn," he said. "You fell in love with a woman who had just committed forgery," she said. "I fell in love with a woman who would do anything necessary to protect the people she loved," he said, "and who was entirely honest about it with me when I asked. Those two things are not the same as each other." She looked at him in the evening light. He looked back at her, steady and direct and present, as he had always been, as she had come to rely on with the full weight of herself. "I love you," she said, not as a reminder but as the kind of statement that needed periodic saying aloud, not because either of them was uncertain of it, but because some true things deserve to be spoken. "I love you," he said back, with the same simple directness that characterized everything he said and did, without embellishment, without performance, just the plain and whole truth of it. The stars came fully out over Kansas, and the prairie was dark and vast and indifferent and also, in its own ancient and enormous way, beautiful, and Evelyn Shepard Sutton sat beside her husband on the porch of their farmhouse on their land. And the past was settled, and the present was good, and the future stretched out before them as far as they could see, which was, on the high plains in the clear October dark, very far indeed. The ink had been wet and the fear had been real and the choice had been made, and the man had looked and chosen to say nothing, and from that silence an entire life had grown, full and honest in theirs. It was, she thought, everything. It was more than enough. It was the whole and exact truth of what a life on the high plains could be, when the right people found each other and held on, season after season, across all the ordinary and extraordinary distances that the world placed between the people it needed to bring together. The cottonwood trees along the fence line between the Sutton farm and the Greer farm dropped their last gold leaves in the October wind, and somewhere in the dark a coyote called, and the stars turned slowly in their ancient patterns overhead, and the farmhouse was lit from within with the warmth of a family at rest. And out on the high plains of Kansas, the land that had been fought for and forged for and loved for lay under the autumn sky, patient and permanent and entirely, enduringly real.